Welcome to the Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers of Washington and its monthly author showcase. I am your host, Peter Stockwell.
Damn fleas? I don't know where they all came from.
Maybe from the flea market. Have you been shopping lately?
No, it all got started with the full moon. I don't understand. And I'm his partner in crime, Mark Miller.
We have a bit of a different show today. This is Claw's second annual Halloween show at BCAT. Mark and I have been involved in this production for over 2 years now, so we thought it was time for another fun show about this special day, All Hallows Eve, just before Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead in Mexico. Might be a good time to make fun and unusual show. We hope to highlight some of the more horrific, nasty and ghoulish excerpts from the works of our author and artists.
We have readings from some of the works provided by past victims of our interviews. If I can just control this itching.
Is that extra hair on your hands?
Yes, suddenly my beard seems to spread. It started with a full moon.
You don't have hairy palms also. You do know what that signifies.
Don't go there. This is a family show. First, to set the mood, we have Mark Allen. Last year, he read from an excerpt from one of his earlier works called Nocturnal about vampires. This, I believe, is going to be an excerpt from his new work, which also involves a hairy situation. If this doesn't freak you out, nothing will.
This is an excerpt from my upcoming novel, Blood Red Moon. Arturo Sandoval walked alongside the city street on the wet sidewalk. An icy chill meandered its way up his spine. The night was cold, foggy, damp. But that wasn't the problem now, was it? He put his fist to his mouth, coughed, cleared his throat. He glanced over his shoulder. The street behind him looked deserted. He tugged at his weathered jacket. Swirling mist ahead of him, hanging suspended, all around him, enveloping him, obscuring what should be a familiar street, transformed it into an alien, inhospitable landscape. Flashes of old horror movies flickered through his mind. The gotcha moments, monsters attacking out of the dark, demented slashers hacking through nubile teenage flesh. Blood and gore everywhere, red splatters across the walls, on the ceiling, dripping onto the floor. But in the movies, it was all fake. No one really got hurt unless something went wrong with a stunt. On a movie set, some director yelled, "Cut," and the dead actors would get up, laugh, and head over to craft services and get a cup of coffee right alongside the actors who had just slaughtered them on film. But out on the streets, life and death took on a different meaning. Violence here was swift and brutal. In the real world, death is permanent. Arturo's breath came in short gasps. That icicle creep working its way up his spine had reached the back of his neck now. The fog was so thick even his feet were unclear on the sidewalk below him, mist flowing around them as if they were liquid instead of gaseous, swirling in to fill the vacuum created by his movement. It was disorienting, and he didn't like that gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. Having been both predator and prey during his years of living here, he knew all too well what this meant. He was being followed. Arturo strode down the block, momentarily forgetting his feeling of being followed. He was still 15 minutes from home, and his mom had already left for her shift at the hospital. He breathed in, filling his chest with the dank air, but feeling a growing sense of self-confidence. He turned into an alley, taking a shortcut that he had taken countless times before. With any luck, he could shave off a couple of minutes of his arrival time. The great beast was already there, having anticipated his quarry's sudden turn into the alley. The beast hid in the shadows, squatting on powerful haunches in the filth behind a rusted garbage dumpster. The beast had picked up his target scent several blocks back. It had followed him from above, moving swiftly across the rooftops, leaping across the expanses between buildings and across city streets. It had prowled the opposite side of the street for the last few blocks. It had considered attacking his dinner while his dinner had stopped to talk to the two others. Butcher all three of them at once, split them open, tear them apart, gorge on their tender meat, bathe in their pumping bright red blood, have a 3-course meal. Fun times. But the beast had decided to follow the rules, single just one out from the herd. There was always one Yahoo who would invariably wander off on his or her own. So the beast had waited, bided its time, scanning the area with sharp, iridescent yellow eyes, long twitchy ears, and an acutely sensitive, quivering nose on the tip of a thickly furred muzzle. And now, here it was, squatting in a filthy alley. It could hear the prey's footsteps now. It detected the distinctive lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub heartbeat from within the doomed human's chest, thumping inside his head with a steady rhythm. Anticipation rising, thin black lips stretched backwards, exposing rows of sharp white teeth. A razor blade smile. Arturo shoved his clammy hands into his pockets just as he heard a low rumbling from up ahead. He stopped in the middle of the alley, unsure of precisely what he had heard. He held his breath, his eyes narrowed, he listened intently. It didn't sound like a dog, not even a big one. Hell, it sounded more like a bear or something. But there hadn't been any bears sighted in the urban Seattle area in decades. And since he heard nothing more in the following seconds, he breathed out and grinned. His heart fired like a jackhammer in his chest. And then Arturo Sandoval's entire universe exploded. With a deafening roar, some massive creature that Arturo, in those final milliseconds of life, could not identify, rose up on enormous hind legs, shoving the garbage dumpster out of the way with one giant arm that ended in an enormous appendage that looked like a combination of an animal's claw and a human hand. But that couldn't be right. Right? Towering above the stunned Arturo, the beast bared its teeth again, saliva dripping off its chin. The monster bolted forward, roaring and slashing, spilling Arturo's stomach and intestines onto the dirty pavement. Pain and fear hit all at once. Arturo found his voice, mustered up the last of his quickly dwindling strength, and screamed at the top of his lungs. The last thing Arturo Sandoval saw on this earth was that massive maw opening wider, teeth exposed, impossibly large canines that looked like ivory daggers descending down upon him and clamping over his skull. Arturo felt an incredible vice-like pressure, then something in his head caved in with a sickening wet crunch. Then everything went dark for all time.
You know we love to share at Halloween. Next, we have Donna Lee Anderson, author, teacher, and local columnist. I believe her piece is about spooky Halloween going-ons.
Young Dracula. This is a story from my latest book called Potluck of Short Stories. The Carpathian Mountains separate Transylvania from the rest of Romania, and in a small village on the Transylvania side of one of these mountains lived a servant girl who was pregnant. This in itself was not too unusual. After all, the servants for the master's castle were mere chattel, to be done with as the master would please. And a bastard baby was of no consequence. If it was sickly, as most of the children that were born of this union were, it would be drowned. Hands were needed to help with the farming, not sickly children that had to be taken care of. Her time was near, and this was not her first time to be pregnant. 2 other babies had been taken from her, and she was determined this would not happen again. This baby she would keep. These last months, since it became apparent she was with child, she began to make plans. In the woods she found a cave in the side of a hill. Branches had been placed to hide the opening, and inside straw was fashioned into a bed. Pots for cooking were stashed behind a large rock, along with a large jug that held water. Everything was ready for when her time came. This evening, her pain started to happen after a long day in the fields. Everyone was tired, and no one took note that she was gone. The cave was almost too far for her to go. The pains were coming so close now that she felt like one continuous red-hot pressure, and she knew that pressure would soon stop and produce a baby. She laid down on the straw, and in a short time a baby was born. She swaddled the little bundle in the cloth strips she had torn from her undergarments, and both of them fell into a deep sleep. When the sun had moved in the sky from morning to noontime, she awoke. The baby was awake too, and hungry. She smiled at his little ears that looked almost pointed, and his eyes had a red tinge in them. And all that black hair, what was this? And he already had tiny, little, sharp teeth. Nursing was out of the question. Oh, those teeth. So she laid the baby securely on a scooped-out place in the straw and went to catch some game. When she returned with a full-grown hen, the baby smiled, red eyes gleaming. The only mothering skills she knew were from those she had learned in the nursery in the castle. She found the piece of leather that she had fashioned into a cone with one small end just small enough to fit into the baby's mouth. Now she placed a half cup of water in one of the pots, water to slow the coagulation, and added a cup of blood from the beheaded hen. Her eyes sparkled with red glints too, much like her baby's. As she mixed the broth thoroughly and poured it into the leather cone, she held her finger on one of the small end and placed it in the mouth of the baby and started to croon. "Sweet baby of mine, now you will dine on the juices of life, and you will always be mine." This one is called Dark Rewards. Did you know that satin will gather the dampness from the air and cling to it like saran wrap on a bowl? Sometimes the moisture turns to droplets of water and they run down my arm like a miniature river, only to pool by my armpit. The damp satin doesn't seem to smell though, and that's a surprise. And did I mention the dark, the never-ceasing, always-present darkness? No glint of reflections from those brass snail heads, and not a flicker of light to let me know the changing of time. The compensation is that now all my time is my own, and so the changing from night to day is of no consequence. I don't know why these things like dampness and darkness even make themselves known. They are only mildly interesting, and only interest when my mind wanders. And that's another thing. More and more I'm finding it hard to concentrate. You see, I do most of my writing in my head first, and since my mind seems to be going out of control, my writing thoughts seem harder and harder to shepherd into any kind of order. Oh well, I guess that's what happens when you die and they put you in a pink satin-lined oak box and they plant you 6 feet under. Loss of control over all of it. And now I'm also losing control over my thought process. Wonder what happens next.
Thank you, Donna. Next we have David Mecklenburg. He has a very horrific story involving a meal and a young girl. Hope it does not ruin your appetite.
This is an excerpt from Hotel de Fantasmas Perdidos. Just to briefly set up the situation, a young girl is looking for her uncle who's disappeared into a hotel. And probably anybody who may know some music that came out in the 70s actually should know what this hotel is. That's the secret to this one story. "Welcome, Ada." She knew my name. "They told me you were asleep." She sounded like 3 people speaking at once. A whisper like an old woman, the sound of a finger rubbing a glass full of water, and a deep voice like a man who sings, "The sky is over Jordan." Her arms were bare and white, but dirty, like that china doll I left outside and lost 1 year ago. When I found her, the doll was soiled and broken, but still beautiful in a way. The woman's dress was made of broken shards of glass, and yet it did not cut her. The glass moved like silk and changed its pattern so that at first it looked like a pond full of water lilies, and then it became dragonflies. Her body glowed through the glass like the horizon just after sunset, as though she were a living lamp. Her face did not change. It was the most beautiful and terrible I ever saw. Her eyes glistened while she looked me over. She held out her moist, cool hands, and her fingernails shone like long carved pieces of polished stone. It was then I noticed her beautiful dress did not cut her, for there was no blood coursing down her legs, which were long and made of the same dirty porcelain. When I looked at her feet, I could see why she was so tall. She floated above me in the darkness like an oxlotl drifts in the dark caves. Her fingernails, red, blue, and green glass, grew longer, making stitching clicks. As she lifted me with both her hands, I felt as if I were a doll made of blue cotton candy, tinged turquoise at just the edge of light and darkness wherein the violet wrought of everywhere but here. "I'm looking for my uncle." "Of course you are. Come in." "Where is he?" I thought you were asleep. A handsome man said this as he passed by me. He smiled, with perfect white teeth, and they shone like his hair beneath the blue lights strung up in the ceiling that did not end. I looked for you in the courtyard, but I did not see you in the swirl of men dancing together. They were all colors, all handsome. I thought you might be happier there. So I waited in an old metal chair and watched, hoping you would sweep by and pick me up in your arms to dance. The music was graceful, old-fashioned, and the men were all so well-dressed, not like they do now. They all wore white coats, black bow ties. Some were sitting out the dance. They smoked and winked at one another and raised their glasses. There were beautiful women, too, broad-shouldered, tall, strong. They all wore lots of lipstick that glistened on their lips. One had a black helmet of hair, like the actress you said you were named after. Another had tight blonde ringlets and was dressed up in a silk gown of blue fire. The women got up and sang sometimes. The songs were mostly of love that hurts like blood and roses. What are you looking for? The woman with the black helmet asked me. My uncle. He's not here dancing. Perhaps he doesn't want to remember. Perhaps he doesn't want to forget. But how? It's almost time to eat. I would wash up. I'm so glad you're not asleep. You must be hungry. The floating woman said this, and she seemed to own and move the place, and she took my hand in her damp, cold one with her fingernails and gently led me. Do you know where my uncle is? Yes, he's here. And she pushed open another door onto an opulently purple room, save for the snow-white cloth that ran down the huge table. You were there, sitting with many others, and you all had wide, empty plates gleaming in the flickering purple light. Sit with me, you said, and patted the seat next to you. You were so handsome with your black hair, oiled back, and your snappy black tie. Your white tuxedo reflected the purple light in so many ways that it was like looking into a pail of milk and grape juice, swirling together, but never mixing. They brought the animal in on a large silver tray. It was alive, pale, and hairless, with patches of its skin that were pink and raw. I think it had 7 limbs. I couldn't tell if they were arms or legs or something in between. Its massive jaw moved up and down, and its tusks were fierce. It had human eyes. You were all hungry, and you all stabbed at it with sharp knives. I remember its blood squirted everywhere, on your hair, on someone's face, on everyone but the woman at the head of the table. It writhed in agony, but the worst was the shrieking. It sounded like wood being torn apart, explosions, a crashing plane, a man dying in fire all at once. And you all stabbed at it with knives and forks and 100 different kinds of needles. But it only thrashed more and spilled its blood upon your fingers. So the handles grew slippery, and people cut themselves as their grip slid down the blades. Here, let me help you. You must be hungry, the woman said, and she snatched at the beast while it was writhing, and her sharp fingernails tore out chunks of its flesh. The blood dripped on the white tablecloth. She handed me the warm, pulpy meat. I was afraid, but more afraid of seeming rude. She sensed this and took one drop on her fingernail. Try it, it's not what you think. And she put the drop on my lips. It tasted like pomegranates and cherries. She put a morsel of the meat in my mouth. It tasted like plums and raspberries, but when I swallowed it, it suddenly became meat again, like the steak tartare Mother made me eat for strength. I gagged, but she kept offering me the food while the beast was screaming and wriggling beneath the knives and clumsy hands. But the tablecloth was no longer white, but deep, sticky red. Aren't you glad you're not asleep? She asked me. I wanted to lie to her, but I'm not very good at lying. My mother tells me so. But as she looked at me, her eyes became like glass peonies, swirling in their petals upon themselves and glittering in the purple light. She was so beautiful and so terrible that I broke away and ran, but she did not come after me. She merely smiled as I left the room. The hallway was long, as good as forever, since the lines that made it went off into a single point in the distance. Or rather, it was not a point, but a darkness, not black, but the color beyond the edge of the horizon. For one moment, the hall disappeared, and a darkness rose like the moon rising above the sea. This was another moon, a moon of emptiness. I walked down the hall and the music played on, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Its echoes suggested one place, the grand dark courtyard that had been filled with beautiful men. Then it sounded as though it was on the roof or in the secret dark places below the ground. Along the sides of the halls were doors. Hotels have many rooms and many doors. People slept here, ate here, lived here, or rather they didn't live here. This is the place that keeps the dead. That is why the moon of nothingness rises here while the rest of the world cannot see it. I wondered what was behind the doors. Some had numbers, others had names. Goldberg, 1176, A82, penetration, 458-87, senescence. I don't know how long I walked. Are you asleep? I don't think so. A man as dark as night pushed a cart full of bottles. He wore all black, and his face was not flesh, but only a well in which all light fell and never returned. His hat was wide, black. I stopped him and asked him, "Have you seen my uncle?" And then there was one light in his face, not quite like a light bulb, but some shapeless light, a blob, like something that a deep-sea fish might dangle at the end of its long, fleshy eska. But that's not what it was. Perhaps it was like a firefly, for it moved around within the confines of his shadowy face. You were looking for your uncle, but waiting for someone else. Yes. But you can't find him or wait for him except by dying yourself. At most, what can you know, my only child, trapped here within the dark and endless halls? And how long shall you walk just like your uncle out there who walks alone himself, like you? And you will dance with us to forget the words. Shame will drive the lovely nails through those pretty feet to feel the rain rust upon the iron. And did they not remove him from the cross upon a dark desert night like this, when the cool wind blew through his hair? His blood was his blessed rococo crosses mounted forever, pounded there and fixed with iron nails, and his wrists upon the wood stained black from burning wax. But out there, you are like the bees within their comb, and the wind will scatter you like husks across the field of the world. The bell rang out, not in any melody I could tell, but it seemed to jolt and stumble like an old man falling down the stairs. Both heaven and hell are populated by souls and angels, the man said. What is the difference, I asked. It is an answer given in the darkness. A lot of life is like that. You get the answer first, and then you have to find the questions that go with it. Tell me, are you asleep? In the end. Thank you.
So, by the way, Mark, what happened to Ratso? You know, the critic from last year.
I needed a snack on the way here. He looked inviting.
You ate a rat?
Hey, like I said, after the full moon, I've had these cravings.
Cravings?
Yeah, cravings. Like right now, I have a need to find a tree or a fire hydrant.
Well, you should have taken care of that before the show started. Jeez.
Next, we have Lauren Patzer. Recently, I interviewed Lauren about his science fiction series. However, he has a taste for the macabre and horror also.
I'm reading from The Dark Collective. This is the short story, The Glove. Alan stared at the mitt, expecting it to glow or jump from the table. It laid still as the air on a stale summer night. It appeared to be a perfectly normal, if well-worn, leather glove. The faded cowhide nearly worn through in places, the stitching loose but sturdy. Alan detected a stain of red dirt on the tip of the pocket where it had scraped the ground so many times after our grounder, it had stained the hide. There was nothing abnormal about its appearance. It was just an old baseball glove. The auction site listed the former owner as Art Donovan, 3 times Golden Glove winner and notorious serial killer. If it hadn't been for his successful run in the big leagues for 5 years, there was some doubt as to whether or not his 5-state killing spree would have been that notable. There were plenty of murderers in the world. Serial killers were disturbingly common, but they were not all famous. To have a baseball player at the height of his career simultaneously slaughtering a dozen people over the span of his career, that was notable. In fact, it was downright legendary. The baseball career on its own was one for the record books. Art had an amazing ability to snag fly balls magically out of the air like they were on a string attached to his glove. Defensively, Art was unmatched in the league. Offensively, his performance varied on how recently he'd been seen on the sidelines, obsessively caressing his glove like a rabbit's foot, trying to rub the luck into his hands before he placed them on the bat. People called it a superstitious ritual. It was all in Art's head. He had the ability, but he psyched himself out if he didn't have a pawing session with the glove right before facing the pitcher. No one on his team called him on it since his ritual seemed to work. The opposing players gave him an earful whenever they got the chance. Halfway through the first season that Art played, he wowed them in the stands. It was also when the first body was discovered. The head of the victim had been smashed beyond recognition with what appeared to be a baseball bat. The damage was so bad, even dental records were useless in identifying the body. A DNA trace matched a serviceman's file, and they finally discovered the body belonged to a rival teammate in the minors that had gone missing weeks earlier. At the time, the link between Art and the victim was tenuous at best. There were dozens of more likely suspects. The fan in Philadelphia that expired with a baseball shoved in their mouth just before the end of the season gave everyone the shivers. Was this the same fan thrown out of a game for tossing things from the seats at Art Donovan? Again, it was a coincidence. Baseball seemed to tie the two victims together, but not in a meaningful way to Art Donovan. It still left many other suspects interconnected to the case. Art's second season was unremarkable. His performance on the field suffered, his team gave him a hard time, his fans turned on him. It was sad to see a player go from shining star to has-been in a single year. Also absent was Donovan's ever-present mitt. People wondered if he had lost his lucky charm and it was messing with his head. The volumes of dead bodies associated with Art Donovan was just as scarce as his glove. No hits for Donovan on or off the field. Succumbing to the pressure, Donovan listened to his coach and returned the third season with the ragged glove in his hand. The body count didn't seem to increase as far as anyone noticed. The third season flew by and Donovan was at the top of his game again. All-Star, MVP, and Golden Glove, he won all the accolades a player could. It all seemed so perfect. Maybe it was the glare of the spotlight that was his final undoing. It was mid-fourth season when police uncovered the killing field, the burial ground with half a dozen victims in Donovan's hometown. Someone had noticed wild dogs gathering in an overgrown field and called out a posse to hunt them down, concerned about their own livestock. One of the hunters stumbled on the remains that had been dug up by the wild animals. A woman who worked the concession stands in a stadium 3 states over had gone missing in the middle of the third season of Donovan's career, when he was at the height of his game. She'd gone missing right after a startling performance by Donovan on the field, ushering his team into their 10th win in a row. Dangling around the neck of her decaying body was a baseball jersey used to strangle the life out of her. It wasn't Donovan's jersey, but it was one of his teammates. The teammate had reported the jersey missing after the game. That put the teammate in the headlights as suspect number 1. One of the other victims had been killed with a souvenir pin, with a souvenir pin shoved into their brain through the right eye socket. Another had been bludgeoned to death with the metal cleats of a baseball shoe. A field rake, ball bag, and other baseball-related paraphernalia featured prominently in the other deaths. Someone was killing people with a baseball theme, and they were doing it a lot. It wasn't until near the end of Donovan's 5th season that police were able to track down his old equipment, sold to collectors and containing trace amounts of the victim's blood and DNA on all of them. Donovan finished out his season before he was charged. He claimed he was being framed. When confronted by the evidence, and some of it indisputably linked to him and only him, he broke down and blamed it all on the glove. The cursed glove had been passed to him for a high price, from a medicine man in New Orleans. Sticking to his story gave him the insanity defense, and he managed to convince a jury. That's why Donovan was still alive. The state auctioned off everything related to the case. The morbidly curious greedily bid on objects of death. That was how Allen had happened upon the glove. He was a big fan of Art Donovan growing up. Now that he was about to enter college on a baseball scholarship, he spent a large portion of the money he'd saved up for college on his idol's single most famous possession, the cursed glove. Allen picked up the glove and turned it around in his hand. He didn't notice any distinguishing marks up close. He wondered briefly if it was even the famous glove. Maybe the certificate of authenticity had been faked. The soft, worn leather under his fingers felt warm and comfortable. He mused this is the nicest glove he'd ever laid his hands on before. He brought it to his nose and sniffed the old leather, smelling of baseball and popcorn from the years of wear and stadiums it had seen. It wasn't until he slid it on that Allen knew this was a special glove. He knew he would do great things with it, break records, and wow the college scouts. His big league aspirations weren't even a full college career away. First, though, he had to get rid of that pesky player from Wisconsin who was vying for his spot on the squad. That nobody thought he could compete with Allen. A swift bat to the head would keep him from ever competing again. The end.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, if you don't have any more cravings, I think it's about time to wrap up this special show.
Well, your leg does look kind of inviting.
Don't even think about it. We at Claw have as a mission statement to be authors and artists, to become known to the public, to expose their artistic endeavors to the residents of Kitsap County and to the world. Thus, we plan to continue this endeavor as long as the BCAT staff and the viewing public still love and support us.
Claw exists for the artists, the authors, to help with marketing, distribution, and publicity. Meet the first and third Wednesdays of every month at the Sparrow's Pizza on Kitsap Way in Bremerton, Washington, at 7 p.m. All are welcome. In addition, filmmakers and actors, we have a related group, Kitsap Peninsula Filmmakers, which meets at the second Tuesday of every month at the Family Pancake House on Wheaton Way in Bremerton. Everyone is welcome.
But we are not the only group out there. Many independent writers and critique groups exist in Washington.
Vincent at 724 Studios on 724 Bay Street in Port Orchard is not only showcasing painters, but is also sponsoring local authors reading their works.
Plus, we have an independent author showcase coming up on the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Thanks to the assistance of the Silverdale Kitsap Mall, some 50 authors from around Western Washington will be selling their books and other artistic endeavors all day on the 24th of November, starting at 9 o'clock until 9 o'clock at night. Come on down and buy some Christmas or Hanukkah gifts for the family and support your local authors and writers. You may need books for the New Year's or birthdays, traveling, or just because reading is a valuable treat.
And Claw plans on having a Christmas broadcast show in December, with Santa Claus and all.
This broadcast interview is scheduled for the end of October, the days preceding All Hallows Eve, at night, when it is dark and spooky. It is carried on Channel 3 on Wave Cable and Channel 12 on Comcast. It also streams on the BCAT webpage at bkat.org. Keep in touch with our Facebook page for updates on what a Kitsap author we will be interviewing in the future. I hope everyone has a pleasant day and a productive and fascinating year. And until next time, I'm Peter Stockwell, and you're
Mark Miller.
And we are with the Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers of Washington.
Oh!
Goodbye, and have a frightful and bite-worthy night.
Corny enough for you?